Hi, I'm Chris Magnano, and today I'm going to be talking about some work we did in creating a workshop for teaching machine learning to biologists. We really centered our workshop around the question, what machine learning training do biologists need right now? And we can break down this population a little bit. We're talking about people who are currently engaged in biological research, so they've completed their formal training and probably don't have too much time on their hands. We're also talking about people who aren't necessarily actually doing machine learning, but they might be people who need to interact with literature that uses machine learning, talk with collaborators, or just understand other research that uses machine learning. And finally, we're dealing with people who have an unknown mathematical or computational background, so it's best to assume that they have none when designing educational materials. So thinking about this population and their needs, we wanted to create a workshop that really focuses on preparedness for simply operating in a research world with machine learning. We decided to make something that has minimal coding and mathematical background and overall was a low time investment. And a lot of more traditional resources, while there are many out there for learning machine learning, don't quite fit this mold. Things like textbooks and courses tend to be too much of a time commitment for people performing active research. We already have many other workshops and boot camps, and we're trying to create a workshop here, of course, but we found that typically they tend to either focus on doing, so they're really interested in getting you up and running coding, for instance, or they might assume prior knowledge. They're looking at teaching what attention is to people who maybe already understand what deep learning is. So after an iterative process, which I'll talk about a little bit later, we settled on these 4 learning goals for the workshop. These first 3 are more content learning goals, where we're really looking at parts of a machine learning experiment. We're looking at common factors influencing model selection and difficulty, things like how much data do I have, or is my problem linear or nonlinear? And this third learning objective, which really emphasizes interacting with literature that uses machine learning. And so we think that's a really important practical skill for biological researchers to have, whether or not their own research will ever involve any machine learning. Finally, we have this 4th learning objective, which is more in the affective domain or focused on beliefs or attitudes. And here we really hope that participants who take the workshop will become more willing to engage with machine learning and consider machine learning for their own research. So here is an overview of the workshop. It's a 5-hour workshop split over 2 days. We try to use real data sets throughout the workshop wherever possible for participants. And we do include talking about some actual classifiers. We talk about decision trees, random forests, logistic regression, and neural networks. And we use those as the frame to conquer that second learning objective, which is focused on understanding problem difficulty and model selection. We finish off the workshop with a skills assessment and then presenting resources to participants for if continuing their education in machine learning in whatever direction they think is appropriate. There are a couple of aspects of the workshop design I want to focus on briefly. The first is this custom piece of software that we built for the workshop. We just call it the ML for Bio software, and it's essentially a GUI written on top of scikit-learn in Python. However, we use this software throughout the workshop to allow participants to experiment with machine learning, try out different classifiers and hyperparameters, explore data splitting strategies, without needing to actually understand how to code. Furthermore, because we designed this software specifically for education, we're able to really enforce proper methodology. As soon as they want to look at the actual testing data set, we force them to make a final model selection, and there's then no possible way in the software to go back a step and train more classifiers without restarting everything. So this really allows us to enforce proper methodology from the get-go while letting participants explore machine learning without the use of code. We also decided to take a more active learning approach throughout the workshop. So in addition to using the software, we have a variety of activities like the one shown here. This is done during the first lesson where participants are learning the definition of machine learning. So we have a couple of scenarios. This is one example. And we have participants using the Zoom annotate feature mark on this scale how confident or not confident they are whether something is or is not machine learning. We've found these types of activities to work really well, and actually more specifically, we've actually found the Zoom Annotate tool to be really great for engaging participants when doing education online. Another important aspect of how we designed the workshop was we really focused on drawing on the prior knowledge of our participants. Everyone coming to this workshop is an active researcher, so already has a lot of skill interacting with academic literature and understanding research. We just need to focus on extending that into the world of machine learning. So one of the major ways we do that is with this activity we call either the paper charting activity or sometimes the mini journal club activity. The way it works is at the end of the first day of the workshop, we have participants choose a paper. So we provide a list of papers that involve machine learning from a variety of biological fields, but we also encourage participants to bring their own if there's a particular paper they want help in understanding. We then have participants form ad hoc groups based on what paper they're interested in reading through for the second day. And so this is, an example of how we're doing the sign up, where underneath each of these paper titles, we would have the people who signed up, whose initials right now are blacked out. We then, on the second day of the workshop, have people first individually, and then in a group with everyone else who chose the same paper, attempt to fill out this chart that summarizes the machine learning experiment. And here we're really careful to acknowledge where there's ambiguity. A really great part about this activity is that we really get to engage with the messiness of real research in the classroom. So we want to really acknowledge when there isn't a clear answer with something or where there's a difference of opinion about a certain methodological choice. This activity also allows participants to really bring their own research area or a specific type of data they're interested in into the workshop and help understand it. So before going into how we evaluated the workshop, I also want to mention its format and availability. Like I alluded to earlier, the workshop was done entirely via Zoom for the evaluated sessions. There were some very early pilots that were done in person. The workshop is up as a set of GitHub pages using the data carpentries template. So we can see a screenshot of the introduction activity here. And all workshop materials, including all of the software materials, are available online to use or repurpose as you wish at the GitHub links below. So the first 5 iterations of the workshop, we really focused on every time improving the design, goals, and format of the workshop. This actually began as a much more traditional lecture-based, slide deck type workshop. Once we felt that the workshop design was relatively finalized, and in the form I've presented so far here, we ran 3 final iterations of the workshop where we actually collected data to evaluate the workshop's performance. For each of these 3 iterations of the workshop, we collected a pre-survey, an in-workshop assessment, and a post-survey. We decided not to do a pre-assessment because we were worried that asking participants to do too much might discourage people from actually taking the workshop. So though we can't make any claims about causality, what we focus on are self-reported increases in interest or comfort in machine learning. And then we use the in-workshop skills assessment to confirm whether or not any post-workshop gains in confidence are justified. So in terms of these self-reported questions, what we used is a retrospective post-then pre-design. You can see an example here where after the workshop we're asking, how confident were you before? This format helps avoid people overestimating their abilities before learning anything about a new subject. And then we did include a single paired question that we asked before and after the workshop just to help calibrate our retrospective questions and make sure we weren't totally off base. The in-workshop assessment then consisted of questions about a modified paper excerpt, which they did during the workshop. And so this is kind of a similar but then more on your own version of the paper charting activity. So across all 3 of these evaluated workshop sessions, we had 47 people attend the workshop. Almost everyone had never taken a machine learning course before, and we had about half of people have at least some amount of coding or command line experience. Another interesting thing to note is that about half of participants mentioned a specific research question, which they were really interested in applying machine learning to. Looking at results from the paired question, that this question was looking at how comfortable you would be training classifiers on your own. And we asked them this question before and after the workshop. And we see that most participants who responded to both went up in comfort from before to after the workshop. Also, while we had some people's comfort go up and others stay the same, we had a single participant whose comfort went down from before to after the workshop. Though again, we suspect that this is that overestimation I was talking about earlier and why we mainly focused on using a retrospective question design. So now looking at the results of the in-workshop assessment, to expand on what I said before, we took an excerpt from a paper that used random forests to predict microRNA binding. We modified that excerpt in a few key ways, the most important of which was that we artificially introduced data leakage into the excerpt. So this research has no data leakage in it, but we took their paper and we changed the wording to add an instance of data leakage. When participants then were asked about this excerpt, we found that almost everyone was able to correctly identify the kind of parts of the machine learning experiment or workflow. So that was really great to see. In terms of the instance of data leakage, we found that only about half of participants were able to correctly identify that data leakage was occurring. We were certainly hoping for a higher percentage of respondents to kind of notice data leakage here, though I should mention that we did kind of choose a more subtle example of data leakage, and possibly if we had done a more obvious example of data leakage, more participants would have caught it. Finally, when asked some other questions about whether or not the metrics were appropriate or if they trust the results or evidence of overfitting, while responses were sometimes split, we found that justifications were generally very appropriate. For instance, looking at the performance gap between the training set and the testing set for evidence of overfitting, or mentioning class balance when choosing an appropriate evaluation metric. Now in looking at these self-reported learning outcomes and kind of really focusing more again on this affective or kind of belief type domain, we found really great results. Participants had large improvements or really consistent improvements to their confidence in machine learning, to how knowledgeable they felt, and most importantly, they felt that when presented with a problem well suited to machine learning, they would be able to identify it and they'd be very interested in pursuing machine learning for that problem. So we were really happy to see these self-reported improvements. Another nice thing here is that very few people said very or extremely for these responses, except for being likely to pursue or notice machine learning. But for knowledge or confidence reviewing, most people said a little or somewhat, which we think is appropriate. We would be worried if after a 5-hour workshop, people said they would be extremely knowledgeable about machine learning or very confident reviewing a paper. So we're happy to see that most people seemed to have an accurate impression of their machine learning knowledge. So in summary, we felt that participants generally achieved learning goals, and we found that the workshop clearly increased confidence and interest in machine learning in participants. We did, however, find that more subtle methodological flaws were very difficult for participants to identify. And so we want to work on that in the workshop, both on improving how we're teaching data leakage and methodological flaws, and also maybe addressing exactly how we introduce data leakage in the assessment and choosing a more obvious example. But overall, while we're continuing to improve the workshop, we're very happy with where it's at. People seem to be very interested in machine learning and excited to pursue it after the workshop, and they don't seem to have a huge amount of unfounded confidence in going and trying to do machine learning on their own after a 5-hour workshop. We also really hope to kind of expand the workshop in the future and do some other work really defining which parts of machine learning are valuable to active biological researchers. So really kind of carefully considering exactly the content that we're including in the workshop. So I just wanted to conclude with some takeaways we had from our experience that might be helpful for others designing educational resources like this. First, we found that it was really great to provide flexibility for participants to bring their own goals into the workshop. Like I mentioned earlier, almost half of participants had some very specific research question or area that they came to the workshop wanting to figure out. And while there was no way to make 24 different versions of the workshop for each of these research areas, we were able to provide this paper activity and kind of free exploration in the software, which allowed participants to get towards answering their own questions or be able to answer them during the course of the workshop. So we found that to be really valuable. One thing that surprised us about the workshop is that people actually enjoyed the assessment. 3 participants mentioned the assessment as being the most valuable part of the workshop to them. When designing the workshop, we were worried that people would complain about taking the assessment, but it turns out participants were really appreciative of having this knowledge check. Though I should mention that we make sure after people take the assessment to go over the assessment so people know exactly what they might have gotten right or wrong. But in general, we think that you don't have to be afraid of adding assessments into your workshops or other educational materials. Great, and so with that, I'd like to give some thank yous. I want to thank the other authors on the paper, members of the Gitter Lab, which also includes me during this research, and also Rosemary Russ from the Curriculum and Design Department at UW, and Deborah Trow with the Morkridge Institute. I'd also like to thank everyone who took the workshop, especially in its earlier pilots and messier times, and Devin Wixon for all of her feedback. And finally, I would like to thank our sources of funding.